Hi there, I'm Lou.
And I'm Lee.
And this is Uncovering History. Hello everyone and welcome to our 11th podcast. Today we'll be covering the life of the prolific, cannibalistic serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. So I'm going to hand you over to Lee, who's been doing all the research.
Hi everyone, so today we will be looking at Jeffrey Dahmer, who was an active serial killer between the late 70s to early 90s before his eventual capture. Now he's also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. However, just like other serial killers that we have discussed previously, such as Edmund Kemper or the co-ed killer, Dahmer was a very intelligent man. His IQ was known to be 145, matching Ed Kemper.
It's a really common trait, isn't it, to have a high IQ for, quite a lot of these serial killers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few in history that have been way above average. And then before we begin, I also want to note that as this episode took a long time to research, it will be broken down again into two parts. So we'll start off with a bit of base information and then we'll go into his early life. So over the years, he has been portrayed in documentaries, films and books, with the most recent being produced currently as a limited series for Netflix titled Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. This will likely be released in early 22. But one that I can highly recommend, though should anyone be interested, is the 2013 documentary The Jeffrey Dahmer Files, and this is certainly one of the most detailed collections to date. And now, as usual, before we begin, I'd just like to start off by saying that this podcast is in no way attempting to glorify the murders or the murderer. And I'd also like to note that this episode will contain information of a graphic nature. So, we'll start at the very beginning. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first of two sons to Joyce Annette, a teletype machine instructor, and Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a university chemistry student. His ancestry was made up of Norwegian, Welsh, German, and Irish. And Dahmer's mother struggled when he was young with anxiety, depression, and low self-worth. This also included herself attempting to commit suicide via an overdose of pills. What with his father away a lot during his studies, neither parent gave much attention, and as such, a rocky start had already begun.
It's really common for these, types of people, the profile of a serial killer to have a kind of disjointed childhood.
Yeah. And when Dahmer was only 3, he underwent a double hernia surgery, which is certainly not a common occurrence for someone of that age.
God, that isn't, is it? That's. I mean, you associate hernias with
middle age and
above, people doing too much or that sort of thing, but not a child.
However, sadly, as we've seen with other serial killers, from the age of just 4, Dahmer became fascinated with dead animals and animals alike. He would often collect large insects and bugs, to which he would store them in jars. He later graduated to the collection of animal carcasses with a particular interest in the biological composition of the animal's structure, focusing mostly on their bones. Dahmer would regularly dismember these deceased animals that he would find and would once again store parts in jars. Now, his father noted that he received enjoyment out of how the bones sounded, and as such, became heavily dependent on the gathering and collecting of animal bones. Now, at the age of 6, Dahmer's brother was born. He was given the choice to name him, and he chose the name David. At this point, his father also earned his degree. And at the age of 8, he would move again, and during a meal involving chicken, questioned his father on how bones react in bleach. Given the background of his father, from a chemical perspective, appreciated his curiosity, and subsequently showcased how to preserve animal bones with bleach. This would be a new skill that Dahmer would add to his arsenal for collecting and preserving the aforementioned bones. During this time, his mother's mental health continued to decline, resulting in further detachment from the family and her children.
It's a bit of a weird... I understand that obviously his father was a chemist, basically. And, maybe there is a bit here of him trying to connect with his father by asking these sorts of questions. But I would, if that was my child, I would be like, maybe that's not quite right.
Yeah, I think it's his father's way of trying to bond with him, given he's been away so much, travelling, studying, and for him to be interested in something that has sort of like a chemical aspect to it. I think he sort of latched onto that.
Wouldn't bleach slowly deteriorate the bone?
Well, I guess it has the potential, but it mostly comes down to being careful with the concentration of bleach and also the time that the bones are in the bleach. So it's quite a common way to sort of preserve.
I guess, and make sure they're clean.
Yeah, and also to ensure that all of the flesh or muscle is removed from the bone.
Lovely.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving forward to when Dahmer was 14, more warning signs continued to show. Dahmer by now was interested in alcohol, specifically beer and spirits. He was known to also drink during the day and while at school. And during his teenage years, Dahmer would experience and begin to understand that he was homosexual, and at this point, from his own words, began to fantasize about dominating a submissive male for his own pleasure. Now, when Dahmer was just 16, he had his first desire to attack. Around his local area, there was a jogger that frequented the streets. Dahmer lay waiting in a bush with a baseball bat with the intention of subduing and performing sexual acts on the victim. However, fortunately, the jogger did not appear on that day and as such was unharmed.
Lucky that.
Yeah, that's quite a sadistic sort of notion to think about when you're 16.
I know, I was about to say he's just 16 here, and I know, you know, teenagers typically have different chemicals going on in their brain at that point, but, I mean, planning this attack, that's really sadistic.
Yeah, we're already seeing a level of premeditation. And as you can see, we're seeing red flags now which have yet to be looked into by family, school, or anyone surrounding him, such as violence, animal cruelty, animal collection, alcohol, and deviant sexual fantasies involving violence. And it, like we said, is certainly not a normal path for a 16-year-old to be taking.
Not at all.
And at this point, he was considered a loner and would often play the role of the class clown, simulating epileptic seizures in school and in shopping centres. Once again, not dissimilar from Ed Kemper, with his games involving the simulation of gas chambers and electric chairs, another huge red flag. Now, at the age of 17, his parents broke up after many years of attempting to work on their marriage. The final straw was when Lionel found out that Joyce had engaged in an affair. Lionel subsequently moved out of the house, with the divorce being finalised a year later, giving Joyce custody of Dahmer's younger brother, David. Now, at this point, I would just like to put out a disclaimer that from here on out, there will be content of a severely graphic nature.
I mean, think about it. From a young age, this child has experienced a kind of very kind of awful relationship going on between his mother and his father. And, you know, up until the age of 17, they still were sort of, you know, there was still friction.
Yeah, there's no connectivity, and it's certainly not like a happy, normal household.
And one of the things, you know, for children and children growing up in specific households is that is the foundation to which that child will see things, you know, and assume that that's normal.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we'll now move on to post-high school graduation and Dahmer's first murder at the age of just 18. Now, on June the 18th, 1978, 18-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks was brutally attacked and murdered by Dahmer. Stephen was last seen hitchhiking to a rock concert, where Dahmer was immediately attracted to him based upon his bare chest. Dahmer savagely beat and bludgeoned him to death with a dumbbell. He also strangled him with the same dumbbell before hiding Stephen in a drain pipe. The next day, Dahmer mutilated Stephen's body in his basement before burying the remains in a shallow grave in his back garden. A few weeks later, Dahmer would return to dig up the remains, removing any flesh still attached from the bones. He then dissolved the flesh in acid before pulverizing the bones with a mallet or sledgehammer before scattering them in the wooded area behind his childhood home. And this was an incredibly violent and heinous act for an 18-year-old to commit.
Wow. I mean, he's still young. I mean, he's barely legally an adult here. And, I mean, that's just so brutal, so violent.
Yeah, it gives you a taste of what's to come. So around 6 weeks after the murder of Stephen Mark Hicks, Dahmer would enroll into Ohio State University, where he would have little interest, focusing more on alcohol. Just like with his school years, he would not use his innate intelligence for good and as such averaged a 0.45 GPA out of 4. In UK terms, that would be achieving a U, I believe.
I was about to say, how does that equate? But for someone so intelligent, you would think, you know, that would be a red flag for a teacher or a professor, surely.
Yeah, I guess, but at this time he was known as sort of being the class clown and not having much interest, so teachers may not have experienced that intelligence yet. But as a result of this, in January 1979, Dahmer would enlist in the United States Army after his father urged him to take control of his life. He trained as a medical specialist during this time at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. And shortly after he was deployed to Baumholder in West Germany, where he served in multiple divisions. Now at this time he was considered to be an average soldier. And in 1981, after consistent alcohol abuse and a lack of military etiquette, he was honourably discharged on the basis that his superior officers did not believe that his struggles in the army would have a negative impact on civilian life. He was given a ticket to travel anywhere and later openly stated that he could not return home as he did not want to face his father. He subsequently moved to Miami Beach, Florida, as he was also fed up of the cold weather and wanted a fresh start.
So again, we've got kind of, evidence here that he is trying to form this connection with his father, especially as he doesn't want him to feel, disappointed in him.
Yeah. And this, however, would not last, and after being unable to hold down a job, accommodation, or curb his alcoholism, he called his father asking to return home. His father allowed such a proposal, and Dahmer immediately moved back to Ohio. But just a few weeks after returning home, he was arrested for drunken disorderly conduct. The alcohol was spiralling out of control, with his consumption increasing exponentially. And in an attempt to put him on the right path, he was sent to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin, where he would regularly accompany her to church and complete chores on a daily basis to keep his mind active. However, after being unable to hold his job as a phlebotomist, he was arrested on August the 7th, 1982, for indecent exposure. Dahmer exposed himself to over 25 people, including women and children, in Wisconsin State Fair Park.
Wow, okay. So, how old is he at this point? Still quite young?
He's just a young adult, yeah.
And he's exposing himself?
Yep.
I mean, I'm a bit confused, really, because it's almost like he's, successfully killed someone, and now he's trying something else?
Yeah, I mean, so he killed someone and then went into the army and had a big lifestyle change, but now he's sort of come back out of the army where I guess there's less military routine and he's falling back into his old ways while also discovering new sort of sinister parts of himself.
I just think it's, obviously the murders are completely horrific, but to expose yourself, we haven't really come across anyone who's done that before. No,
not so far. In the episodes we've done, at least. So, moving on to January 1985, Dahmer reported that he was propositioned by a stranger in a public library where he was offered fellatio. Dahmer did not accept the offer, but it did stir back up previous thoughts and fantasies that he had experienced as a teenager. As a result of this experience, he began to frequent gay bars and bathhouses. He also stole a mannequin which he would perform sexual simulations on in his grandmother's home until she discovered it and demanded that he got rid of it. The frequency of his visits continued throughout 1985, and after his arrest, Dahmer, in an exclusive interview with Inside Edition in February 1993, stated that it's a process that doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as an object for pleasure, instead of living, breathing, or human, it seems to make it easier to do things that you know you shouldn't. This was during the discussion where he spoke of his frustrations towards his sexual partners that moved during encounters.
Oh my goodness. So he doesn't really value people.
No, he basically said he had to work on detaching himself from that human, so he would just see them as an object as opposed to a human.
He's just basically trying to objectify his victims.
So to satisfy his needs and frustrations, in early 1986 he began drugging his partners with sleeping pills, allowing him to perform sexual acts on them without them moving. He would mix the pills with alcohol to hide their existence. But he would eventually lose his access to the bathhouses after people began to process what was going on, and as a result, Dahmer would move his illegal activities to hotels. Now, in August 1986, Dahmer was once again arrested for masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys near Kinnickinnick River. He admitted the offence and was charged for indecent exposure, but, after some time, he later changed his story and claimed that he had just been urinating. Unbeknown to him, witnesses had corroborated the statements initially given. The charges were oddly changed to disorderly conduct, and on March the 10th, 1987, Dahmer was sentenced to 1 year of probation with a requirement to see and undergo counselling. Now, on November the 20th, 1987, 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi encountered Dahmer at a bar where he was persuaded to return with Dahmer to his hotel room. With his normal routine, Dahmer drugged and took advantage of Stephen. The following morning, Dahmer woke up to find Stephen dead underneath him, with extensive bruising and bleeds from his mouth. Dahmer's fists were also heavily bruised. Now, in a later confession, Dahmer stated that he had no recollection of killing Steve. However, that did not stop him from disposing of Stephen's body using a large suitcase, which would enable Dahmer to get the body back to his grandmother's house.
Why do you think he was taking it back to his grandmother's house?
Well, he subsequently decapitated the head and severed the arms and legs from the torso. He then removed the flesh from the bones, as with the first victim, before cutting the flesh into small pieces. He once again wrapped the bones up before breaking them down with a sledgehammer aggressively. He disposed of the remains, excluding the heads, in bins. Now, approximately 2 weeks later, he boiled the head while attempting to preserve the skull, which he later used as a stimulant to masturbate with. When the skull became too brittle, he smashed it, just like the bones, and then disposed of it.
That's incredibly horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. And after this event, Dahmer began to actively seek victims after finding enjoyment from his recent heinous and vicious crime. Now, on January 16th, 1988, Dahmer would seduce and lure 14-year-old James Edward Doxtador with the prospect of earning $50 for nude photos. Dahmer strangled him before keeping his body in his basement for over a week. Dahmer then dismembered him and discarded his body in rubbish bins. Unfortunately, no remains were ever found of James.
That's really awful. I mean, he's 14 years old. His family must have been absolutely feeling excruciating pain.
Yeah, so we're already seeing a trend once again. Like other serial killers, he's preying on the vulnerable, offering people that he perceives to need money for services, bringing them to a place that he knows well and out of their comfort zone without them even realising.
Wouldn't a body start to smell after a couple of days?
Yes, it would absolutely.
So why do you think it was never kind of picked up by his grandmother?
So we will get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that point in a bit. So on March the 24th, 1988, 22-year-old Richard Guerrero was drugged and strangled with a leather strap in Dahmer's bedroom in West Allis. Dahmer proceeded to dismember the corpse in his basement, once again dissolving the flesh in acid and disposing of the bones in rubbish bins. Continuing from his previous MO, he kept the skull after bleaching it before disposing of it months later. Tragically, as with James, no remains of Richard were ever found. Now, moving forward into April. On April the 23rd, 1988, Dahmer once again lured an unknown victim to his home with the intention of drugging and strangling him. However, fortunately his grandmother realised he was not alone, and as a result, Dahmer took him to the County General Hospital. He was sinister and vicious, but clever, and as such did not want to arouse suspicion, especially not from the one other person living with him.
Say that again. What did he do? He drugged someone and strangled him and took him back to his grandmother's house.
No, so he brought him back to his grandmother's house and he had the intention of drugging and strangling him. However, during the process, his grandmother came home, and as such, he made out that the person was unwell, took him to hospital so that his grandmother wouldn't become suspicious of his actions.
My goodness.
And then just left it at that.
That person must be feeling so lucky.
Well, I guess, yeah, the person was never named, so we don't know any more about it, apart from what he said. So in September 1988, his grandmother asked Dahmer to move out due to the disturbing smells coming from the basement and the garage, and due to being fed up of him bringing young, unknown men to his house at all hours. He moved to North 25th Street on the 25th of September 1988. So there, as you spoke before, his grandmother did realise, got fed up, and didn't understand the process, as probably had never been around a dead body.
I know, but, there is a distinct smell. Think about it. When animals bring in prey and you've been away for the weekend, there is a distinct smell of decaying tissue.
I know, but in her eyes, she may never have experienced that. So the idea might just be it's a foul smell and, she would not be able to process exactly what it was or pinpoint that it was in fact decaying flesh. So in January 1989, Dahmer was convicted of a second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. The sentencing was suspended until May 1989. Dahmer then temporarily moved back into his grandmother's apartment, and on March the 25th, 1989, 24-year-old Anthony Lee Sears was brought back to Dahmer's grandmother's home, where he was drugged, strangled, and murdered. Dahmer once again maintained during a confession that he had no interest in committing a crime until Anthony had spoken to him. An awful and disgusting excuse. But in 1991, following Dahmer's arrest, preserved genitalia and Anthony's skull were found in his North 25th Street apartment. Now, this was the first time that Dahmer had retained any body parts. He initially stored them in a wooden box at his place of work before moving them to his apartment.
So I guess what we have here is this idea of like a trophy.
Yeah, he's beginning to collect trophies, yeah. So on May the 23rd, 1989, Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction, while being required to register as a sex offender. 2 months before his scheduled release, he was paroled, and in May 1990, he would once again move back into his North 25th Street apartment after spending more time at his grandmother's after release. Now, at this point, it baffles me that after all of these charges and convictions that he's still able to walk around a free man.
I don't really understand the way that the law is working at this specific moment in this specific area, because, like you say, there's so many charges, so many convictions. He's clearly dangerous, and especially around vulnerable young people. Why on earth has he been released? Yeah,
he's been arrested, he's been charged, he's been given suspended sentences, he's even on the sex offenders list now. There's a lot that suggests that his punishments don't fit the crime. But on May the 20th, 1990, just 1 week after moving into his apartment, 32-year-old Raymond Lamont Smith would be murdered by Dahmer. Dahmer drugged and strangled Raymond before spray painting and preserving his skull. Before this process would occur, he also purchased a camera to take photos of his victim. This would be Dahmer's 6th victim.
Quite a few things going on here. Okay. Why is he deciding to spray paint the skull?
So it's another way of preserving the skull.
And now he's taking photos.
Yeah, so his MO is once again evolving into enjoying the process and wanting to savour that moment.
I think what's most shocking here, again, is that for all his victims, there's this kind of, one of the MOs is to drug them, to make them more vulnerable than they are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. It's all about taking advantage and knowing who he can take advantage of. So on May the 27th, 1990, just 1 week later, Dahmer would once again lure an unsuspecting victim to his home. However, on this occasion, Dahmer accidentally drank the drink with the sleeping pills in. Now, upon waking up the next morning, he realised he had been burgled for items of clothing, money, and his watch. He never reported this to the police, however, as he didn't want to arouse suspicion to his own house. But this would only be later disclosed during his confession in 1993.
Well, serves him right.
Yeah, he's in a difficult space because, like you said, if he goes and tells the police, and there's a chance they'll go inside his home, try and collect evidence, any form of DNA, anything that the burglar may have left.
It would be riddled with DNA.
Yeah. So, he had no option but to keep quiet and carry on. So on June the 14th, 1990, Dahmer lured an acquaintance, 27-year-old Edward Warren Smith, to his apartment. He was last seen with Dahmer at a party, and as with other victims, Dahmer violently drugged and strangled Edward. Dahmer subsequently put Edward's body in a freezer for several months, hoping that it would not retain moisture. After realizing that the freezing of a body would not remove moisture, he acidified the body and destroyed the skull, due to attempting to dry it in the oven. Dahmer later made a disgusting claim during confessions that he felt sick about the murder due to not being able to keep any of the body parts.
Oh my goodness, so he's not feeling remorseful, he's actually disappointed with himself.
Yeah, and he's evolving once again. He's trying to figure out new ways to preserve body parts or to process the body how he wants it.
And just think, if he had remained in custody, if he had been, kept in prison, this wouldn't have happened.
Well, he'd have been sentenced, and then who knows what would have happened when he came out, but there's definitely that possibility, yeah. So moving forward to September the 2nd, 1990, 22-year-old Ernest Marquez Miller encountered Dahmer outside a bookstore. After once again being lured back to Dahmer's apartment, Ernest was viciously murdered by having his carotid artery severed with the same knife that Dahmer used on previous victims before being dismembered in Dahmer's bathtub.
What's a carotid?
So it's the name of an artery.
Okay.
So it would lead to severe blood loss and exsanguination. So this time Dahmer adjusted his MO by storing the entire body in a filing cabinet while also retaining his heart, biceps, and portions of his legs in the freezer. He would later consume these while also performing other acts such as bleaching the bones before coating them with enamel to aid preservation.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he's deteriorated even more into this sadistic hole that he's dug for himself. So he's now eating his victims. Yeah,
so this is the first victim that he began being a cannibal from, yes.
What is wrong with this person?
Too much to know. So just 3 weeks after the heinous murder of Ernest, Dahmer would strike again. 22-year-old David Courtney Thomas got chatting to Dahmer on the 24th of September outside a local mall. After once again luring David to his home on the promise of paying him to pose nude, Dahmer strangled and murdered him. Dahmer later confessed that he wasn't his type, but decided to kill him anyway. Dahmer would once again take photos during the dismemberment of the victim. And tragically again, David's body has never been recovered.
It's just awful for the families and friends. You know, they are in turn victims themselves because they never have that closure.
Yeah, no, there's something with this case that perpetuates, and that is a lack of closure, a lack of clarity for the families, for the victims, for people involved.
And, you know, this person, it wasn't even, you know, he says it wasn't his type, but he still decided to kill him anyway.
Yeah, that's the sort of innate aggression and desires that he can't control to the point where he is just picking anyone at this point. And throughout the remainder of 1990, Dahmer would unsuccessfully attempt to lure multiple men to his apartment. During this period, Dahmer told his parole officer that he was suffering with anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts.
I was about to say, you know, surely he has to check in with some sort of parole officer. And, you know, obviously it's very difficult to try and see through people's facades. But surely, you know, there must have been an inkling, something.
Maybe, I guess, because of the nature of his past, maybe the officer didn't look into it too much or just didn't really care that much. And there's not that much information about where they would meet. So from what I could gather, it doesn't seem like they would ever meet in his apartment. Wow. And as such, there would be no flags once again that would be raised. So
very doubtful.
He was very careful about who came to the apartment, and typically it would only be his victims or people that would attempt to be a victim but then fortunately escape. So, on February the 18th, 1991, 17-year-old Curtis Durrell Straughter was approached by Dahmer as he waited for a bus near the local university. Dahmer subsequently lured Curtis to his apartment where he was drugged, handcuffed, and strangled with a leather strap before being dismembered in Dahmer's bathtub. Curtis's skull, hands, and genitals were kept by Dahmer. This would be Dahmer's 10th victim. And now we're also seeing that his depravity has no bounds and once again is evolving. Each kill is evolving and adding something new. And around 2 months later, on April the 7th, 1991, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay was drugged and unfortunately tested on. Dahmer later referred in his confessions to this being a new drilling technique. The process involved drilling into parts of the victim's skull before injecting hydrochloric acid into the brain. Errol became conscious during this process, and as a result, Dahmer re-drugged and then strangled him. Dahmer flayed the skin post-mortem and kept the skin for several weeks. His goal from this was to preserve the skin permanently using a cold water salt solution. Errol Lindsay's skull was found during Dahmer's arrest.
That's awful.
Yeah, so we're seeing that each kill he's trying something new. The last kill isn't enough for him. He needs to find a deeper level of depravity.
I mean, drilling into someone's head and then putting acid into the brain while that person is basically still conscious.
Yeah, he literally, in the saddest way possible, he used him as a test dummy, which is horrible. It really is horrific to think about. And on May the 24th, 31-year-old Tony Anthony Hughes, a deaf mute, was lured to Dahmer's apartment, once again believing that he would be paid money for posing nude. As Hughes was deaf, Dahmer communicated to him through written notes. Tony was drugged and strangled, with his body being left on Dahmer's bedroom floor for over 3 days. After the attack took place, Dahmer then dismembered the body while taking photographs during the process. Tony was later identified via dental records after his skull, as like other victims, had been retained for Dahmer to use post-mortem.
That's so shocking. Again, we've got someone who is, vulnerable. A deaf mute, they are vulnerable. And it's just, I can't really get my head around how and why he's doing this.
So he picks his victims very carefully. He picks victims that he perceives to be in a vulnerable state, be it needing money or needing help or needing a warm place to sleep for the night. And as such, he lulls them into a false sense of security, to which he's then able to drug and murder them.
Such an evil thing to do.
Yeah, no, he is. He's up there as one of the most evil serial killers of all time.
I'm not surprised.
Now, during 1991, other residents within the apartment block had continuously complained about foul-smelling odours coming from Dahmer's apartment, number 213. Alongside this, residents also reported continuous banging sounds and the infrequent use of a chainsaw. Dahmer used excuses such as the food in his freezer spoiling or his tropical fish dying, to which he made it clear that he would sort the matter. Now, this continued for months, and the complaints began to pile up.
I mean, from any sort of, law enforcement, these sorts of complaints, do you know if they were taken seriously?
So all the reports were made to the landlord, and from what I could gather online, the landlord liked Dahmer, thought he was a nice enough man, and as such gave him the benefit of the doubt, as in, he's just having a rough time, he's lost his pet, or he's had some food that spoiled. It's innocent issues. Unbeknownst to him, that it was actually multiple murders taking place.
So what he's done is he's manipulated his landlord into believing that he is a good person.
Yeah. I mean, if we look back to the other episodes we've done, people like Ted Bundy and Edmund Kemper, they were incredible at blending in. They were very good about making friendships, building trust levels to the point where no one would ever consider that they were the one to blame. And this is exactly the same here. He's moved into an apartment block and he's settled in very well. And although people are complaining, no one is taking it to the point where they're thinking anything sinister is going on. In the eyes of his other tenants, it could just be, well, maybe he's not hygienic, maybe his apartment's very messy, that sort of thing. Things that you'd imagine to be the case.
Yeah.
As opposed to, there's a serial killer living in my flats.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first thing you go to, really, is it?
Exactly. And that is where we'll wrap up part 1 of Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, this episode has again involved a large amount of research, and as such needed to be broken down into 2 parts, similar to Ted Bundy and Son of Sam. But I also wanted to ensure that the appropriate amount of respect was given to the victims of these horrible tragedies. Now, in this episode, we've discussed his early life, teenage years, the red flags, and early adulthood leading into his vicious spree. And in the next episode, we'll bring us to a close.
This has been a really harrowing episode. I mean, I know that all of the serial killers that we've covered so far have been awful, but I think the depravity and the viciousness of the crimes that you've, taken us through today, they've just been so shocking.
Yeah, no, they really haven't. And although all of the other serial killers that we've discussed are incredibly violent and, vicious, malicious and depraved, Jeffrey Dahmer really is, he's up there as one of the most disgusting humans that's probably ever going to live on this planet.
It's interesting though, because obviously, I've heard of him, but I didn't quite know the story behind him. Whereas, like I said, when I did my podcast on Ed Kemper, everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he did. And I think for someone that has done such awful, awful crimes, why do you think someone like Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, they've almost had the spotlight? Why do you think that is?
Well, Ted Bundy's always been glorified as the biggest serial killer in history, and Edmund Kemper wasn't that well known until Mindhunter came out, but because of the series and its popularity, that brought Edmund Kemper back to the forefront of the news, and as such more people began to learn about him, began to become more interested in him. And I think that's why if you mention that name now, more people are likely to respond with sort of knowledge rather than shock.
Okay, well, thank you. And as always, if you guys have any questions or suggestions, you can always contact us at uncoveringhistory.co.uk, or you can send us an email directly to uncoveringhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Also, make sure to check out the Instagram page to keep up to date at Uncovering History Podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you very soon for Jeffrey Dahmer Part 2.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
See you later.